Through his documentaries, he has taken on the issues of religion, segregation, and racism. And in doing so, Stanley Nelson has educated us all on the way we as a nation have evolved. His newest film, Freedom Riders, will air here on Houston PBS on May 16th at 8 p.m. But we're pleased to have Mr. Nelson with us this evening. Tonight, a discussion on Jonestown, Wounded Knee, and the Civil Rights Movement. I'm Ernie Manous, and this is Houston 8. Joining us tonight is Emmy Award-winning filmmaker Stanley Nelson. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you so much.
So when you pick a film, well, I'm just going to jump right in here.
Okay.
A film, as we all know in this industry, and probably many of our viewers do, does take a big chunk of one's life to create.
Right.
How do you decide what's worth that time for you?
Well, I think you've got it right there. I mean, I want to try to make a film that's important to me because going in, a lot of times I don't know how long it's going to take. One of the great lessons for me was my first film, $2 in a Dream, took me 7 years to make. And so it was a 7-year chunk of my life. And, you know, after that I thought, okay, I'm on my way. But the next film I did took me 7 years to make also. So when I go into a project, I really want it to be something that's important to me, that's worth what might be another 7 years.
Looking at the film, your body of work, do you see yourself in what you've chosen to do? Can you see the things you were struggling with in your own life at any point?
Not really. You know, I mean, I think that each project is what it is, and I come to each project differently. So it's not like I choose projects based on my life or based on any one thing. There's a lot of different reasons for doing every project.
Okay, we're going to start with Freedom Riders then. And we'll come back to Freedom Riders quite a bit through this. But Freedom Riders, what was it that drew you into this story? You've covered elements of the civil rights movement before. Why this? Why now?
Well, that's a complicated question because there's always more than one reason. On the surface, you know, this is the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Rides, 2011, so that was one reason. On a storytelling level, it was just this great story with all these kind of ins and outs and like this roller coaster ride, and, you know, brought in the Kennedys and Martin Luther King in unexpected ways. So there's that. As a filmmaker, I'm like, well, you know, the people are still alive and they're still vibrant and there's footage, you know, and there's great pictures and there's music. So, you know, all of those things came into play in deciding to make Freedom Riders.
I've noticed that a lot of your films and your body of work, you either have the socially relevant films, and I don't mean disrespect when I say this, or there's music. They seem very tied together in your world.
Yeah, well, I think for me, I want the films that I make to have some kind of social relevance. That's just for me, and I don't think that all filmmakers should do that. I mean, that would be horrible if every film we saw, you know, had some kind of deep social relevance. But for me personally, that's what I'm interested in filmmaking, and that's what's important to me in making a film, is that it has some kind of reverberation, you know, for people, that it doesn't, especially I do a lot of historical films, that they don't exist in this kind of bubble, you know, that oh, that was nice, you know, but that they really have some relevance to our lives today.
Which makes me curious, because I'm looking at Freedom Riders and I'm watching it and I'm thinking, how have things changed when we can still have incidents like Rodney King or New Orleans or things that have happened since? How do you see all of that working together?
Well, I think that when you see Freedom Riders, I mean, two things. You think, you know, wow, that was a long time ago. The country really has changed. And then on another level, you think, wow, that was really a short time ago. I mean, these people, you know, lived through it and they're still alive. But I think for me, when I see it, I can't but help but think that the country has changed for the better. You know, we're not perfect. We got a long way to go. But you see the venom and the hatred and some of the craziness back then, and you think, well, you know, we have come a long way.
Yeah. When you made your Jonestown film, reading interviews that you'd given at that time, you talk about understanding what they were doing, seeing the positive in what went on there, and relating to that story. When you do a film like Freedom Riders, can you ever understand, relate to the segregists, the people that were, as we see now, in the wrong, but can you follow where they came from? That
was a really important point in making the film, is that we tried to give the other side and at least make you understand what was going on in the white segregationist mind in the South. Because, you know, at the bottom line, we had to keep thinking, we want the viewer to keep thinking, these people just wanted to sit together on a bus. You know, they wanted to sit together on a bus and eat together in a restaurant. So what about that made people go, what is really insane? I mean, they tried to, you know, set the bus on fire. They did set the bus on fire and tried to hold the doors closed and burn people up on a bus because they were trying to sit together. So it was really important for us to try to at least give you a window into what was going on in the South at that point.
And what I realize while we talk here is we have been spending so much time here at our station with what we're planning for May. We've never set up what the Freedom Rides are for some of our audience who might not know what we're even talking about. Give me a brief history of what was going on and what happened.
Well, in 1961, 12 people, there were 6 whites and 6 blacks, decided they're going to test the segregation laws of the Deep South. And they're going to get on Greyhound buses and they're going to get on Trailways buses and they're going to sit together on the buses. They're going to eat together in the restaurants, in the bus stations. The white people are going to use the colored-only restrooms. The black people are going to use the white-only restrooms, and they're going to basically go down south and see what happens. They have no police protection, no army protection, no National Guard, and it starts out with these 12 people just getting on buses in Washington, D.C., and they're going to travel from D.C. to New Orleans. That's where the story starts. Right. It goes on from there, and it becomes a movement.
They often say that history is written by the winners. In an age where there is video and footage and all, and we can go back and find things, and people say, is that changing now? Is history becoming more honest, if that's a fair way to put it?
That's a hard question. You know, I don't know. I mean, I think that what happens is, and what we found out when we made Freedom Riders, is that yes, you can find history, but it takes a lot of digging, you know, and it takes a lot of hard work to go back and reconstruct history. I mean, when I was approached with the idea by American Experience, you know, they said, "Oh, we've got this idea to do this film on Freedom Riders," and I was like, "Oh, yeah," you know, I kind of knew the term, but I didn't know what it was, you know, and I didn't know the ins and outs of the story, so it took, you know, just reading and digging to find that out, but then to find the footage and to really bring out the stories and the characters was not easy.
I'd heard that you, well, of course, I'm sure any filmmaker in your shoes wants to do this, to find that nugget, something that people haven't seen before. Was there footage you found that was like, that's my smoking gun, that's something I need in the film?
Yeah, I mean, we found great footage that had never been seen before. I guess the greatest story was that we read in an FBI report that they had confiscated a film from a guy when the bus was actually burning, that his son had taken the Super 8 film of the bus burning, and that they had confiscated, the FBI had confiscated it, and we went back to the FBI and asked them, you know, do you have this film? And they said, what film? And we faxed them the page from the testimony, and 8 months later they said, oh, we found this film, and they actually sent us the film, and nobody had seen this film before, actually, of the bus being set on fire and burning.
When you talk about what you can find and such, when we go back over to the Jonestown film you made, people always assume everybody died at Jonestown.
Right.
Not true.
No. There were a few people who actually were there and lived. We have 2 in the film. I think there were actually 4. I think the other 2 had passed away, but who were actually there and saw their families die, and the other people, 900 people at Jonestown, die.
And there was a softball game or a baseball game or something?
There was a basketball game that night, so there were a number of people who were part of the Jonestown community who were in the main city of Guyana who were not there when it happened. There are also a number of people who were still stationed in San Francisco and the Bay Area who weren't there. But 2 people in the Jonestown film were actually there and actually saw their loved ones die.
What spoke to you about that story?
Well, I think it was. Let me tell you how we came to do the story, which was really funny because I work with my wife, and she came home and said, you know, I heard some Jonestown survivors on the radio today. It was like an anniversary, and she said, you know, what the story that they told was just incredible. It was totally different from what we know. They weren't crazy. They sounded sane. They were talking about this socially active church that did all these great works. And she said, you got to hear this. And so we got the tape, because I think it was on NPR or something, so we were able to get the tape and listen to the audio tape. And that's what started the ball rolling, because it was so different. It was just such a different story. And I think that, once we thought about it a little bit, it was like, wait a minute, well, you couldn't, how could you have 900 insane people anyway? So what was it about this church that made them join? And what was it that made them stay and stay and stay and be led down this path that was so wrong? And I think for us, part of the story was that it was about, what people will do to be part of something bigger than themselves. We all want to be part of something bigger than ourselves. We want to be part of something big. But what happens when you tie yourself to the wrong ship, you join the wrong thing?
Right.
I thought it was just a fascinating story.
Do you feel people are inherently good?
Definitely.
So when you do something like Freedom Riders, and you've got states that are making these laws and fighting against the African Americans and stuff like that, do you believe those people inherently think that what they're doing is good?
I think they think what they're doing is right. I don't know if they think, in that way, good or bad, but I think they think what they're doing is right. And I think that that's one of the things that we try, I try in all the films that I do, is to try to at least give you an idea that these people are human, and what is it? There's this guy in Freedom Riders who talks about how, he just saw his society sinking. And, he has this sense of just helplessness of his world coming to an end, this world of segregation in the South. And he says, I just had to hate somebody. Mm-hmm. I just had to hate somebody. And it's just a really incredible moment of him trying to explain what was going on in his head back then.
What I like about the film so much is that you're following an incident. You're following one event, but it's a wonderful example of everything that was going on through the civil rights movement. Right. And we all know about, some of our audience lived through it and understands what was going on with segregation. But I think when you see it in your film, you realize what harsh lines were truly drawn, how there was a subclass of people within our own society. And I think for today's audience and the younger people that will see this film, understanding how that came to be is still mind-boggling.
Yeah, I think one thing that really makes the film work is that there is no narration. So there's nobody kind of telling you what to think. And where we talk about the segregation and the kind of rules of segregation, a lot of that is told through film clips from back then where people are talking about how they felt back in the 60s. But also, people are talking about what they were thinking, some of our interviews, like what they were thinking back then. And so it's fascinating. And I think that there's this special connection that the viewer has because there's no narration. Mm-hmm. There's nobody kind of telling you what's going on. There's nobody telling you what to think. You hear it and then you absorb it and then you figure out how you're going to react to it.
Right. In the film, the now N-word, as we call it, is used. Concern, issue over... it is a part of the story, but do you worry how the reaction of folks from hearing it?
Not really. I think that when you talk about, that point in history, you have to use the words that are used. One of the shocking things for me when I first started out as a filmmaker is I went to the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and they still have the terminology in the file cards, so it'll say pickaninnies, eating watermelon, and I'm like, well, why do you have that? I actually went to one of the guys, and I said, well, why do you have that? He said, we look at it as history. We look at everything in here as history. We're not, that's part of history. So I think it's part of history. I don't think there's any way you can avoid it, and it's up to kind of the individual stations, to beep it out or do what they do.
You talk about history, and we look at film. Some of us, hopefully, will look at film as just another educational tool. I'm curious your view on film being used to educate.
I think film is a great tool for education because I think that one of the things that film does is entertain while it educates. And so that's always kind of in the forefront of my mind is that, that what we're doing also is entertaining. When you watch Freedom Riders, you have that clicker in your hand and you're ready. You're on the verge of going to whatever else is on.
Right.
And you have all these different choices. So how do we entertain you? And I think history is very, very entertaining. There's something about knowing our past and seeing something that's real, but also as a story, as a narrative. I think that's one of the great things about the Freedom Riders and just the story.
Right.
Besides the film, besides the film that I made, it's just such a great story with all these kind of, ins and outs. You think it's over, but it's still going, and characters come in and leave, and it's really like this epic drama.
There is a Freedom Riders book, and there is your film.
Right.
How do the two work together? What's taken from which for what, and how does that all work?
Freedom Riders by Ray Arsenault was the book, and so the film is based on the book. But the original book is 700 pages long. So, as I say to people, a film is like the introduction in a book. It's like one chapter. I mean, that's the amount of information we can get in, if even that. So, a lot of it is cutting the story down and cutting it to its bare bones, but making it richer at the same time.
Right.
If that makes any sense.
It does, and also it's a different bit of the story. It can be the same story, but it comes alive through film, I think, that's different than reading it. And that the two together make for a nice dance, if you will.
Yeah. I mean, in film, you have characters and with personality. I mean, we really look at them as characters, the same as in a fiction film. You have characters and you have personality, and people live. They jump off the page and live.
Now, you've taken this film to China recently?
Yeah. I just got back from China, actually, which was just an incredible experience. We went there with Sundance Film Festival, has a program where they're taking different films around the world.
So what is their understanding, first of all, of the civil rights movement that we had, and what was their reception to the film?
I think that their understanding of they are taught the civil rights movement, but in some ways, it was interesting because they, I think, are taught in a way that we are sometimes in the United States, which is like Martin Luther King. That's what they know, and so that was their understanding. The reaction to the film was incredible. One of the things that was just so great for me as a filmmaker was that the questions were almost the same as they were in the United States. The first couple of questions were the same, as the same questions as the United States. And then there were the other questions that were just, just Chinese, so about censorship and about a nonviolent movement and can it work in China and those kind of things. It was just an amazing experience.
Do you see, as horrible a part of our history as it is, do you see that same kind of struggle happening in a very similar way in other countries? Or is it very unique to our experience?
I think that the core of the freedom rides is nonviolence. And that was actually taken from Gandhi in India, and it had already worked in Gandhi in India. It worked here. To a large degree, the struggle in South Africa was also nonviolent. Not completely, but in most ways it was. I think nonviolence can always work. It's something that can always work.
I look at the film and I look about what happened and how it unfolded back then. And I think about today's media age and how things like that would be covered differently. What did you find in the expression of how it was covered in the day or how it would have been covered today?
Well, what was incredible about the Freedom Rides was that in the beginning there were only 2 members of the press on the Freedom Rides, and they were both members of small African American newspapers. Once more violence happened, then the media started to come in. But what was fascinating about the Freedom Rides was that even in 1961, the mobs went straight for the press and kind of beat the press away. I mean, they knew enough that, let's get the coverage, let's get the coverage, beat the coverage back, and then let's do what we want to the Freedom Riders. So even in 61, they were very sophisticated about, let's get the press out of here.
You talk about the 2 reporters that were with it, and they come from black press, and you did a documentary also on the importance of the black press. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, I think that the way I came to do the film on the Black Press was in a couple of other films I did on African American history. I would find that I would always be looking at the old microfilms of the black newspapers. I'm looking at these microfilms, and one day it just hit me. Wait a minute, this is a story in itself. I mean, I'm looking at a paper from like 1925, and I'm thinking, wait a minute. This paper had a black publisher. It had black writers, black photographers, black cartoonists, black people operating the typesetting machines. This was this whole industry, and it wasn't just in one city. It was almost in every single city in the country had its own, African American newspaper, and it was just such a different story than we hear about the African American community, especially back then, and that's what started me on the road to make that film.
As you've made these films, as you've lived this life, what has been your understanding of the black community, and how has it changed going through this?
Well, I think that one of the things that I really learned in making the Black Press was that at that point, until the Civil Rights Movement, really, the black community was a community because physically, it's not just, okay, we're black people, but it was physically a community because black people had to live together. So it didn't matter what you did. If you worked in a bar, if you were a doctor, if you were a lawyer, if you worked, whatever you did, you lived in this community, and it was very different. So it was a physical thing that it no longer is.
Similarities with that, with the American Indian experience, living in communities. You did, of course, the Wounded Knee film. Do you see any similarities there? Yeah,
I mean, I think that one of the fascinating things to me in doing Wounded Knee was going on to the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota and seeing that Native American people, they're still a strong community.
Right.
I was shocked when we went into houses there and people were speaking Lakota. They were still speaking, and so in some ways, it seemed to me that one of the things that Native American people did was say, okay, we're gonna keep our communities, and we're gonna try to maintain our culture. We may not have anything else. We may not have the land we have. We may, not have the money, but our culture is central, and let's try to keep that.
And I'm trying to think what's the most sensitive way to ask this question, because I'm sure there are some people out there wondering this. When you have these strong communities, and they have what they have, and then we become more homogenized, and we become what we are today, do we lose something in that process? And if so, what can we do to retain the good of those communities?
Sure. We definitely lose something. And I think, what's the expression? You can't, make scrambled eggs without
make an omelet without cracking some eggs.
Yeah, you got to crack some eggs. And so, for me, it's that kind of thing. You do have to lose something. How do you maintain a core, and how do you maintain something of the culture? It's funny when you say that, because it just made me think of China, which is really going through this now, which, I mean, I've never seen anything like the amount of building and progress that's happening in China. I was there 15 years ago, and it's like just a totally different place, and I think that's a huge nation struggling with that. How do we go forward but hold on to our culture and to something? How do we do that? I think it's something that we all struggle with.
So do we have an answer, though? Or is it just a good question at this point?
I think it's a good question. I think it's a good question, and I think it's an essential question, because I think, what we don't want is, wouldn't it be horrible to come back in 100 years and the whole planet looks the same? Everybody, everything is just the same.
My last question is, we're running out of time.
Sure.
Does the story of the African American in America tie directly with what we think of as general American history, or are they going back and forth?
They're the same, and I think that's what, one thing that I struggled to do in my films is to say this is a different way of looking at American history. This is all of our history. This is a big part of all of our history, but it's just it's like a different way of looking at it, and I think that's what makes it exciting.
Yeah. And the very last thing, importance of PBS in being able to do this kind of work for you.
Nobody else does this kind of work. Freedom Riders took a while to make. When you see the film, it's a dense film. This is a film that could not be made in 10 weeks or 8 weeks. Nobody else but PBS gives the amount of time and makes it so important to get things right.
Right.
And to get things right, but also we hope to entertain, while it's getting things right. And it's just been a glory for me to be able to make this film and the other films I've made for PBS.
Yeah, and I apologize. That was a little bit of a self-serving question in there. When you watch it back, too, are you still editing it as you watch it today?
No.
No, you can let it go.
No. Usually with film, with the films, I mean, I've done my best. I've done my best, and if I when I see it, I just sit there like anybody else and watch it. There's a weird feeling though that sometimes it's of amazement that it kind of all came together as it did.
Well, we look forward to sharing it with our audience. Thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you for having me.
Now, each week we invite you to visit our home online at HoustonPBS.org. Simply click on the local programs bar, pick Houston 8, and you can join our online community. Read about the guests, learn more about the topic, and even watch past episodes. Now, here's a programming note for you. On Monday night at 8 p.m., Houston PBS will air Roads to Memphis on the American Experience, a look at the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. Then, that following Friday night on Houston 8, we'll look at the works and legacy of Dr. King and how they are still being felt today. If you have questions or comments that you'd like to share on that topic, feel free to email us at houston8@houstonpbs.org. That does it for us tonight. Until next time, I'm Ernie Manous. Thank you for joining us. Have a great week.